This is a flipped video for systems of the basics for ESS, and I'm asking you to take Cornell notes on this, just the topic, the essential question, the heading, and the notes section, please. And then perhaps an hour later, then go back and read through your notes and highlight and circle vocab and asterisk possible test questions, and put question marks where I wasn't clear. So the objectives of this, these are objectives from the ESS guide, and I'm going to not go through these for the sake of time, but I do want you to just read through and make sure you understand that these are the command terms. So if you want a little practice in what command terms are, go look at the command term list that I gave you in your bulletin board. Examples of systems. We talked about this a little bit in class. This is a environmental class, and so we're going to be talking a lot about ecosystems. In an earth science class, you may talk about weather systems. In bio, you may talk about the cell, or like the nervous system. It doesn't have to end in system to be a system. The Dow Jones Industrial Average we mentioned today, that could be considered an economic system, and there are social systems also. So these are just a few of the systems that we have out there. All systems have, though, they all have what we considered inputs, which are, it's either matter or energy. Well, actually, let me just say, and outputs. And both of these involve the flow of matter or energy. And it's important, the or is important, because when you talk about inputs and outputs, many times matter and energy are kept separate. There's also something called a storage, which is it's a stored matter or energy. And that would be like the carbon in a tree, for instance, or fat in an organism. That's stored energy in the form of fat or carbohydrates. Could be water in a dam would be a storage. So this is system terminology, and we're going to start talking about models and system diagrams. Model is a representation of something that's real. It's a simplification, and it has its limitations, but it also has its uses. So a storage, matter and energy, what I just talked about, is a lot of times represented by a box, or it could be represented by a circle too sometimes. A flow is done by arrows, and so there's two types of flows, inputs and outputs. And so if I had a storage here, an input would be going in to like that, and an output would be surprisingly going out of the storage. These arrows might have magnitude. A bigger arrow or a wider arrow would mean a bigger amount of energy or matter flowing in or out of the storage. There's boundaries also, and not every model uses these boundaries, but they're lines that represent the boundary. So say that these were two systems here, and we had two organisms. We had these were oaks, and these were the red maples that we saw. Well, you can make a boundary of just the oak tree if that's going to be your system. And that would be, it could be a line. A lot of times it's dotted line. Or we can make the boundary the whole community, which is, the collection of both trees, both populations of trees. And that's going to have different inputs and outputs. And so it's very important to define your boundaries in these models. So the next thing is, a lot of times inputs and outputs are defined as processes. And what you do is, there's two types of processes which we'll discuss later: transfers and transformations. Both of them are matter or energy. Remember the or. And so some examples of this are respiration, photosynthesis, and diffusion. And this is what you would label arrows with. And so if I had an output that had to do with diffusion, for instance, something leaving the system because of diffusion, I would label the arrow diffusion. So, an example. Say I had a storage. That's storage. And this would be a tree's biomass. Biomass we'll get into later. You don't need to know this now, but a biomass is the dry weight of the tree. So it's everything in the tree, not including the water. And that is a measure of how much CO2 was synthesized or assimilated into the tree. So it is an important measurement that we will look at later. And so if I was to look at the inputs, I'm going to make the inputs red. So it's coming into the system, and I could make a boundary if I wanted to. All right, so that connects the system with outside the system. So coming outside of this tree would be CO2, would be an input. And then coming up from the soil, which is another system actually, would be nutrients and water. And of course light would be coming in. And you'd have some heat coming in. So that would be the inputs. So I'm going to just put this meaning inputs. It's good to have a little key here. Change the color up. This is going to be your outputs. So outputs would be, well, there's heat going in, but there's also heat coming off of it. So that would be an output. There's oxygen, O2. There is leaf litter into the soil, or just, I'm going to say litter. That's the dead leaves. Oops, erg. Doesn't like to erase, so I'm just going to go, sorry about that, folks. Litter. And so that's sticks and dead leaves and things like that. And of course there's water vapor also leaving, going into the atmosphere. And then I might have also the part, the tissue that's consumed. Spelled wrong, but I think by herbivores, organisms that eat plants. And so, well, that is a systems diagram in a simple form. So you could also, if this is like an animal, this could be the herbivore. And so that's the tissue. And so now I've connected two storages with a flow. And that flow, you could label that as, you could label that consumption. The act of consuming. And so that would be how you use the process labels. So, and there's a lot more processes here that you would also include. the leaving of the H2O, that's evapotranspiration. And, the light and the CO2, all collectively, those would be photosynthesis, and other things like that. So flows, transfers versus transformations. So both flow is any movement of matter or energy, as we just said. And so the difference between these two is a transformation is when you have a flow that, so there's either a change in chemical composition, so a chemical change, or a change in state. Transfer, on the other hand, is if there's the opposite. There's no changes. There's no chemical change, or there's no change of state of the matter or the energy. And so examples I can give you here. So if I had a pond, for instance, and the pond is the system, and so I have an input of the water, of H2O, going in, but I also have an output of water, H2O, going in. So there's no change of state. It's water in, it's water out. Same stuff. There's no change of state. There's no change of there's no chemical change. That would be a transfer. Now, let's change up the colors. Now I have water going in, all right, but I also have water leaving as water vapor. And that is the process of evaporation. Now it went through a process. There's a change of state. So that would be a transformation. Some other transfers would be like mudslides, or if you're looking at a transportation system of cars going in and out of the city, they're not changing state. They're not changing at all. It's the same cars, and so those things are all transfers. If I'm looking at nitrogen and considering that as I breathe in nitrogen, because air is mostly nitrogen. But I breathe out the same nitrogen. It doesn't affect my body. I don't absorb it or anything like that. And so the same amount of nitrogen comes in, comes out, unchanged, transfer. Transformation, another example of transformation would be photosynthesis, would be respiration. Each of those things, the inputs and the outputs are going to be a different chemical composition or a different state.